In the previous section, we discussed how case law can be overturned through higher court decisions, legislative changes, or constitutional amendments. Now we turn to an equally important question. Which courts in Arizona have the authority to create common law? Understanding this hierarchy is essential because not every court decision establishes binding precedent. Only certain levels of courts in Arizona have the authority to interpret statutes, clarify ambiguous laws, and create or refine common law through their decisions. These interpretations become part of the state's legal framework and guide how future cases are decided. The structure of Arizona's court system. Arizona's judicial system is structured in three main tiers: the Superior Courts, the Court of Appeals, and the Arizona Supreme Court. Each level plays a distinct role in interpreting and applying the law. However, not all courts have the same authority to create or establish common law. Arizona Superior Courts are the state's trial courts. They hear both civil and criminal cases, including those involving real estate disputes such as breach of contract, quiet title actions, foreclosures, or landlord-tenant conflicts. Superior Court judges apply existing statutes, administrative rules, and precedents when deciding cases, but their decisions do not typically establish binding common law beyond the specific case at hand. These rulings can, however, be appealed and become part of the record that may lead to new case law if reviewed by a higher court. The Arizona Court of Appeals is the state's intermediate appellate court and has significant authority to interpret and shape common law. Arizona is divided into two appellate divisions, Division 1 in Phoenix and Division 2 in Tucson, covering all counties. When the Court of Appeals reviews a lower court's decision, it may affirm, reverse, or modify the ruling. The written opinions issued by this court become part of Arizona's published case law and are binding on all lower courts, unless overturned by the Arizona Supreme Court. Through these published opinions, the Court of Appeals has the authority to interpret statutes, clarify ambiguous provisions, and develop new principles of common law when necessary to resolve disputes. The Arizona Supreme Court is the highest court in the state and holds the ultimate authority to create, modify, or overturn common law. Its decisions are binding on all lower Arizona courts. The Supreme Court typically hears cases that involve significant constitutional questions, conflicting appellate rulings, or issues of statewide importance. Because of its broad constitutional authority, the Arizona Supreme Court's rulings not only interpret the law, but can also establish or reshape major legal doctrines that affect the entire state. When the court issues an opinion, that ruling becomes the definitive statement of Arizona law, unless superseded by legislative action or future constitutional amendment. ARS Section 12-123 establishes the Arizona Supreme Court's power to make decisions that become binding on all lower courts, forming the foundation of Arizona's common law. How appellate and Supreme Court decisions create common law. Common law develops when appellate and Supreme Courts issue opinions that interpret unclear statutes, resolve conflicting legal interpretations, or fill gaps where no statute exists. For instance, if there is no statute defining the fiduciary duties of real estate agents, the courts may apply common law principles, rooted in fairness, trust, and professional responsibility, to define those duties through their decisions. Each published opinion contributes to the evolving body of Arizona common law. For example, when the Arizona Supreme Court decided Hill versus Jones, 1986, it established that sellers and agents have a duty to disclose known material defects in a property. Although this duty was later supported by statute, the initial legal standard arose from common law as developed by the courts. Similarly, the Barnes versus Lopez, 1985, decision clarified offer and acceptance principles under contract law, another area shaped by judicial interpretation rather than legislation. These rulings demonstrate how appellate and Supreme Courts actively create common law through interpretation and reasoning. Why trial courts do not create common law. Trial courts, such as the Arizona Superior Courts, are primarily responsible for applying existing law to individual cases rather than creating new law. Their decisions are fact-specific and do not establish binding precedent for other courts. However, when a trial court's ruling is appealed and reviewed by a higher court, that review process can lead to the development of new common law. Thus, while trial courts contribute to the evolution of law indirectly, it is the appellate and Supreme Courts that have the authority to formally create and publish binding legal principles. The hierarchy of precedent in Arizona. Understanding which court decisions carry binding authority is crucial for real estate professionals who wish to stay compliant with current law. In Arizona, Arizona Supreme Court decisions are binding on all courts in the state. Arizona Court of Appeals decisions are binding on lower courts unless contradicted by a different division or overturned by the Supreme Court. Superior Court decisions are not binding on other courts, but may be persuasive if well-reasoned. This hierarchy ensures a consistent and predictable application of the law statewide while allowing for flexibility and adaptation as new legal issues arise. Example in real estate practice. Suppose a superior court in Maricopa County rules that a broker's failure to review a sales contract does not constitute negligence. This decision affects only the parties involved. However, if the buyer appeals the case to the Court of Appeals and the appellate court issues a published opinion ruling that brokers have a legal duty under R4-28-1103 to review all transaction documents, that opinion becomes binding precedent for the entire state. From that point forward, all Arizona brokers are expected to comply with this interpretation of the law, as it has become part of the state's common law through appellate review. Review summary. In this section, you learn that only certain levels of Arizona's courts have the authority to create common law. The Arizona Supreme Court and Arizona Court of Appeals establish binding precedents through published opinions that interpret statutes and clarify legal principles. Superior courts, on the other hand, apply existing law but do not create binding precedent. The appellate court's written opinions collectively form the body of Arizona common law, ensuring consistency and predictability in how real estate disputes and other legal matters are resolved. Discussion 1. Which levels of Arizona courts have the authority to create common law? Answer. The Arizona Court of Appeals and the Arizona Supreme Court. 2. Why don't trial courts typically create common law? Answer. Because their rulings apply only to individual cases and do not establish binding precedent for future cases. 3. Which court has the highest authority to interpret and establish legal principles in Arizona? Answer. The Arizona Supreme Court. 4. How does the Court of Appeals contribute to common law? Answer. By issuing published opinions that interpret statutes and clarify legal principles, which then become binding precedent for lower courts. 5. Why is the hierarchy of court authority important in Arizona real estate law? Answer. Because it ensures consistent interpretation of laws and provides clear guidance for brokers, agents, and consumers across the state. Closing remarks. Only the Arizona Court of Appeals and the Arizona Supreme Court have the authority to create common law through their published opinions. Their interpretations form the foundation of how statutes and administrative rules are applied in everyday real estate practice. For licensees, understanding which courts create binding precedent is vital to maintaining compliance and professionalism. Court decisions from these higher levels of the judiciary not only resolve disputes, but also shape the ethical and legal standards that govern Arizona's real estate industry. In the next section, we will explore how legal precedent functions within this system, how it is established, followed, and sometimes distinguished, to ensure fairness and consistency in Arizona's legal process.